In this video, we shall be learning how to answer questions from a quadratic graph. Now we've plotted this graph. The graph of y equal to x squared plus y plus 3x minus 1. And we use the scale of 2 cm to 1 unit on both axes. Now this is the graph. So we shall look into the questions and see how to answer questions from a graph. The first question is, what are the roots of the equation? So this is the equation of the curve. We will now look at the graph. In a given graph, to find the roots of the equation is where the curve, the quadratic curve, cuts the x-axis. So at this point, and this point, these are the roots of the equation. Now let's learn how to read that. We have that this is a scale of 2 cm is to 1 unit. So between 2 cm is 10 boxes. That means each of these small boxes is 0.1. It has a value of 0.1. And how else to do it is, the value you place at the end of each of the 2 cm of your graph, you divide that value by 10, because there are 10 boxes in between each 2 cm in this graph, both vertically and horizontally. So when you divide it by 10, that value you got is the value of each of the small boxes for that axis. So since we have that 2 cm is to 1 unit, so 1 divided by 10 is 0.1. So the value of each of these small boxes is 0.1. Now, look at this. This is 0, right? 0.1, 0.2, and this is 0.3. So this value is in between 0.2 and 0.3. Therefore, this value here is 0.25. That is 2.5. 0.25. So it's not up to 3 from the graph we have here. Maybe when you draw a different graph, you could have something else. Then on this part, we have minus 3, right? Minus 3.1, minus 3.2, and this is almost touching minus 3.3 on this curve here. But I'm going to take the in-between values. I'm going to assume is at the in-between values. Or let me just take it as minus 3.3. So you take the values you could see on your graph. There are ranges of value for correctness of a graph, because the way you drew your graph is not the exact way the other person draws their graph. So there are ranges of values in which those answers are still correct. So we have to write down the answer. We have that what are the roots of the equation? So whenever the roots of an equation is asked for, they are asking for where x is equal to 0. So we have x equal to minus 3.3 and x equal to 0.25. Now to the next question. Find the minimum value of y. So minimum values are usually asked when that graph is a positive graph. That is when it's an upturned graph like this. We can see that the smallest value on y-axis is at the bottom of this graph. So this is the minimum value of y. So we have to trace this point to the y-axis using a ruler. All these markings should be on your graph. The markings show that you're answering questions from your graph. Whenever you have a graph and you've been asked to use the graph to find, you should make markings on the graph to show that your values are from the graph. Okay, so this is the point on the y-axis. We have that this is minus 3, minus 3.1, minus 3.2. So I'll have this point as minus 3.2 on the graph. So we have to write it at the answer page. The minimum value of y is minus 3.2. Value y equals minus 3.2. 2. And you could also be asked, what is the value of x where y is minimum? So if it is so, we have to trace this midpoint, this least value. We have to trace that midpoint, trace it to x-axis to go and find what it is at x-axis. And as we can see from this graph, it is minus 1.5. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the value of x for which y is minimum is negative 1.5. So in case you see such a question, you know how to answer it. Or it could also be called the axis of symmetry. So if we look at this graph, we see that at this point is where the graph divides into two exact points. Whatever thing we have on this side is what we have on this side. You can see this point, this point, this point, this point, and the rest of them. So we could also have it as axis of symmetry. So, but if we ask for axis of symmetry, we are looking for what x is at that point. So the axis of symmetry of this graph is x equal to negative 1.5. Okay, let's look at the next question. What is the value of y when x is negative 3.5? We come to x-axis and look for minus 3.5. We can see that is this point. What we do is we place a rule there and we trace that point up to the curve. So this is minus 3.5. We are going to trace this point with a broken line to the curve where that point touches the curve. At that point, at the point where it touched the curve, that is at this point, we are going to trace it to y-axis to find the value of y for which x is minus 3.5. So when we trace it, we can see it's this point. So this point this is 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, 0.8. So we have it as 0.9. The value of y, where x is this, so we have that y is equal to 0.9. Now finally we have find the values of x where y is equal to 3. We are going to come to y-axis and look for where y is equal to 3. We can see the y-axis where y is equal to 3. So what we have to do, thank God, is even a marked point, but we have to show that we are answering from the graph. We have to show these markings on the graph. We have to trace with broken lines where the curve touches where that line of 3 on y-axis touches the curve on both sides. And then we are going to trace down. We don't just read it. We have to make tracings on the graph with broken lines. So we can see that x is equal to negative 4 here. And on this part, we trace down. We can see that x is equal to 1. So the values of x equal to minus 4 and x equal to 1. So this is just a few questions on graph, and we've seen how we can answer it. Next, we are going to see more questions from graphs, and this time a negative graph.